want to make sure I record. I want to thank the NASIC Standards Committee for sponsoring today's webinar. The title of the webinar is Communication of Retractions, Removals, and Expressions of Concern, CRC or CREC, Shaping Ethical Research. Before we get started, I have a few CEC announcements. After the webinar, you will be receiving a link to a short evaluation form and a link to the recording. You may find previous webinars listed on the NASIC's website at nasic.org/webinars. And I can put that link in the chat. We also have archived recordings on NASIC's YouTube channel. And I wanted to make an announcement about our April webinar, which is called Creating and Implementing an Inclusive Metadata Policy, scheduled for April 17th. With that, I will be passing things over to the chair of the Standards Committee, Matthew Trescon.
Hello. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Keandra Bailey, Caitlin Backer, and Joanna Zarapovich. Keandra Bailey is a Standards Program Manager at NISO. The National Information Standards Organization is a nonprofit association accredited with the American National Standards Institute that identifies, develops, maintains, and publishes technical standards and recommended practices. In her role, Keandra facilitates the work of NISO members and volunteer groups on various initiatives as they work within the community to encourage broad post-publication adoption of their output. Before joining NISO, she worked as the Digital Access Specialist at Duke University Press. She's also an active member of NASIG, serving on its Standards Committee and SSP's Early Career Subcommittee. She received her MLS with concentration in digital libraries from North Carolina Central University. Caitlin Backer is a Discovery Technologies librarian at the University of Regina. Her portfolio includes a range of library systems and technologies, including the Library Services Platform, Discovery Systems, Authentication Services, and Metadata Enrichment, with a focus on creating interoperable systems to enhance discoverability. Caitlin holds an MLIS from McGill University and is currently a PhD candidate at Maastricht University. Joanna Zarapovich is a digital production team leader at Taylor & Francis LLC, where she oversees the quality and accuracy of online publications by adhering to metadata standards and best practices. She specializes in project planning, managing innovative online systems, and optimizing workflows. Joanna's favorite part of the role is making research easily accessible, putting knowledge at the fingertips of researchers worldwide. We will please drop your questions in the chat or the Q&A. We will address those questions as time permits. So shall we begin?
Can everyone see my screen? Great. Hello, everyone. I am Keandra Bailey, and as mentioned, I'm one of the Standards Program Managers at NISO, National Information Standards Organization, aka NISO, just like to say that, spell it out for people. And I will be kicking us off today. So we will be talking more about the CREC recommended practice. So for today, we are going to cover a bit of background on the project, the problem of retractions and continued citation of retracted papers, talk a little bit about the NISO CREC working group and summarize the recommendations in the paper, and go over some takeaways, next steps, and how you can help specifically for librarians. So, quick introduction to NISO, in case you weren't familiar. NISO is a nonprofit industry trade association that's accredited by ANSI. We run the gamut of information world in terms of our membership. We have libraries, library trade organizations, publishers, publisher organizations, vendors, and many types of different content providers, intermediaries, and everyone who contributes to the information ecosystem is equally important in our eyes. We create standards, recommended practices, technical reports, and white papers. NISO is best known for standards, but we publish a large amount of recommended practices as well. Recommended practices are distinct from standards in that while standards are prescriptive, recommended practices serve as a guide. One of the output that we'll be discussing today by the Communication of Retractions, Removals, and Expressions of Concern working group is a recommended practice. And recommended practices serve as best for emerging technologies and processes like the one we'll be discussing today. So, bit of background on the project, bit of a history lesson on how we all ended up here today. This working group coalesced out of a presentation at the 2021 NISO Plus conference. The presentation was entitled Misinformation and Truth from Fake News to Retractions to Preprints. The precursor to this session was the Reducing the Inadvertent Spread of Retracted Research, Shaping a Research and Implementation Agenda, aka the RISERS grant, from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which was headed by Jody Schneider out of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, sorry. Both of these represented a multidisciplinary effort comprising librarians, publishers, and other stakeholders within the academic publishing ecosystem to reflect on issues produced by the continued citation of retracted research and produce solutions as well. In the next hour, we will discuss more about retractions, but just a quick bit of information on why this is so important. Retracted research is published work that is withdrawn, removed, or otherwise invalidated from the scientific and scholarly record. This may occur for different reasons, which can include error, misconduct, or fraud. Although retractions are relatively rare, it has an outsized impact on the scholarly record. Retracted research that is integrated into the scientific publication network via citation, either before or after retraction, enables the inadvertent propagation of potentially unsupported or fabricated data, fundamental errors, and unreproducible results. The grant produced a final report with these final recommendations as a way forward of combating the continued citation of retracted research. And just in case it's too small, I'll read them out for you. So the first was to develop a systematic cross-industry approach to ensure the public availability of consistent, standardized, interoperable, and timely information about retractions. Recommend a taxonomy of retraction categories, such classifications, and corresponding retraction metadata that can be adopted by all stakeholders. Develop best practices for coordinating the retraction process to enable timely, fair, unbiased outcomes. Educate stakeholders about publication correction processes, including retraction and pre- and post-publication stewardship of the scholarly record. And so with those recommendations out of the RISERS 2020 project, the NISO CREC working group was born. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin so she can talk a bit more about the group and a bit more about why retractions matter.
Great. Thanks very much, Keandra. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us here today. My name is Caitlin Backer. As you heard, I'm the Discovery Technologies Librarian at the University of Regina, and I also had the pleasure of being involved with the NISO CREC RP development. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about the problem that we're trying to solve here and why it is that we needed an RP, part of it goes back to the idea that retraction is meant to be a corrective mechanism. And we expect that when something gets retracted, readers are going to realize that something about it has been flagged as problematic and that it shouldn't be relied upon. However, in practice, we don't really see that manifestation, that people actually are aware. What we see instead is that most citations to previously retracted publications continue to cite those publications as if they never were retracted. Generally, most research puts it at about 5% of citations to retracted publications, indicating any awareness of the retraction. In systematic reviews, it's slightly higher, it's around 20%, but it's important to note that that's a research method that involves really intense engagement with the published literature in a way that might not be typical in most research articles. And nevertheless, it still means that the vast majority of publications that are citing retracted research seemingly are relying on it as valid. Next slide, please. So we might wonder, why would authors do this? And of course, it's not possible to say why somebody would cite something just based on the citation alone. But, I would hazard a guess that people most likely who are citing retracted publications and aren't indicating an awareness probably just aren't aware that the publication has been retracted. And, we might wonder how that would be possible because, if we were to be asked for many of us, well, what does a retracted article look like? We'd think of something like this, where, it's almost impossible to not realize that, oh, this has been retracted. However, sometimes indications of retractions can look a little bit different. Click, please. Sometimes indications of retractions can look like this. And if you're wondering where the indication of retraction on this publication is, if you'll click again, Keandra, it is right down at the very bottom of that first page. So certainly not as prevalent as the others, and potentially something that could be overlooked, even though the item has itself been updated. Next slide, please. Now, we might assume that once something gets retracted, that's it, and that it'll get watermarked, it'll get updated in some sort of way. People who are searching for studies, our library patrons who are using our resources, they're going to be able to tell somehow that something has been retracted. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Some colleagues and I did a study, and we looked at 441 retracted publications in public health, and we looked for each of these items across 11 different databases, and then recorded if and where the record indicated that the publication was retracted, and then we did the same thing with the full text. And we found that about 50% of the metadata records to retracted publications weren't marked as retracted. So there wasn't really a way that somebody would know based on the metadata that, in fact, this publication had been retracted. Where the full text was available, we found that about 13% of the HTML was unmarked and 57% of the PDFs weren't marked. Next slide, please. Okay, and this figure just shows the different locations on the record where a retracted publication might be marked as retracted. So it could be an annotation in a title or an abstract, it could be in a banner, it might be in controlled vocabulary, a link to the retraction notice, or somewhere else, like a bespoke or a repurposed field that might be unique to that particular database. And both within and across databases, there is variation. So not only is the fact that the publication is retracted not always present, but in cases where it is present, how and where will differ. But rather than just kind of showing you these findings in the abstract, I wanted to share a few examples of what this looks like in practice, because I think it makes it a little bit more understandable what this lack of consistency is and why it might be a challenge for library patrons. Next slide, please. So here we have 4 screenshots of records for the same publication across 4 different databases, and these were all taken probably within about 30 seconds of each other. And these databases have all indicated in some sort of way that the paper's been retracted, but they're all doing it differently. PubMed and Web of Science both include a banner, but PubMed also emphasizes the link to the retraction notice, and it's got some associated controlled vocabulary. Web of Science annotates the title. Ovid Medline includes the information regarding the retraction in what they call their title comments field. And then Scopus, and I'll say this, if your eyes are like mine and maybe are not so great, it might be a little bit hard to see, but on the basically the left-hand side under document type, it says retracted. And so these are all ways in which these resources will note that something has been retracted. Other presentations could include having something at the bottom of the record, in with the bibliographic information, or in other locations. And this can vary platform to platform, but it can also vary within the platform. Next slide, please. So here we have 3 examples of some different retracted publications in one platform. Sometimes the title is amended with the word retracted. In 2 of the 3, there's a banner with an update notice, although one's called a corrigenda, the other's called an erratum. They're both actually retraction notices, so it's not immediately clear to a user that these have been retracted, but there is a link to some sort of additional information. And this isn't visible in the screenshots, but in 2 of the 3, the publication type's been updated to retracted, but in the other, it's still article. Now, this is Scopus, right? It's the world's largest abstracting and indexing database. So it might seem kind of obvious that, you're working with different metadata from different sources, different formats. There might just be inconsistencies as a natural byproduct of that. Next slide, please. However, we also find that even within a single journal, there can be some variability in how retracted publications are displayed. So here are 3 articles from Psychological Reports. They were all published between 1993 and 1995, and they were all retracted in either 2020 or 2021. One has the word retracted in the title, and they've actually replaced the entire abstract with the retraction notice, as well as including a link to the retraction notice. The other, or one of the others, includes a link to the retraction notice, but it doesn't change the title or the abstract. And then the third doesn't include any of those things. So the actual item itself wasn't updated. And so all of this can be pretty confusing for the average library patron. It's not really surprising that people would continue to treat retracted publications as if they never were retracted when we think about, how complex it might be for somebody to determine whether or not something's been retracted. They might need to look in multiple places on every page, which they might not know to do or even where to look. And then they would need to do that both within the database, but also across different databases, because just because it's not marked as retracted, one resource doesn't mean that it isn't retracted. Very few people are going to do this. It should also be noted that with some of the fields or some of the presentations, if somebody exports that information into, say, a citation manager, that the fact that the publication's been retracted doesn't get exported alongside that. So even if it is in the database, if they say export it into their reference manager, their citation manager of choice, they may not have access to that information. Very few people are going to go through all of these steps, right? Like, people are generally speaking going to assume that what they see in the database, what they find on the publisher site, is an accurate representation of the article. And so that's where the NISO CREC recommended practice kind of comes into play, because this variability may, in part at least, be because there haven't been international standards or best practices previously, and that is what we're really attempting to do. Although I should note that when I say there haven't been standards or practices, I'm kind of just referring to the metadata and transfer, and display part of the conversation. Organizations like COPE have excellent guidance on when to issue a retraction notice and what to include in that notice. Next slide, please. So the NISO CREC working group together, our aim was to address this question. Once a decision is made to retract, withdraw, or publish an expression of concern by an appropriately authorized organization, how do the scholarly communications ecosystem and other information consumers become aware of and share information about the status of the original object? So essentially asking, like, what metadata standards, what associated workflows are going to help to facilitate clear, timely communication of retractions, expression of concern, and removals so that the scholarly record can be effectively corrected. Next slide, please. So to help complete this work, we formed two subgroups. We had a publisher subgroup and then an aggregator end user subgroup to consider the workflows and processes, both that were currently in place, but also that would be ideal. And we kind of thought of these as sort of being two perspectives. So you have the publisher, kind of the data producer side, and then you have that aggregator or end user, maybe the data receiver. And this was really intended to have some in-depth conversation about what the challenges, what the unique needs are of both groups. So the publisher subgroup investigated the existing workflows, the practices, such as if and how publishers update PDFs and titles, and a broad range of practices emerged, which is somewhat reflective of the different structures that are undertaking and supporting this work. Next slide, please. So of the publishers represented in our subgroup, about 62% reported that their standard practice was to leave the full text PDF online, but to watermark it with the word retracted on all pages. For the remaining publishers, practices included adding the retraction notice as a cover sheet at the beginning of the PDF, removing and replacing the full text of the article with the retraction notice, reducing the article down to the abstract and then watermarking that with retracted, and not updating the PDF. At least one publisher also noted that practices would differ if the item were in a supplement as opposed to a regular issue. Next slide, please. Now, practices around the HTML and the associated metadata were also pretty varied. About a third of the publishers didn't report a standard practice. Now, that's not to say that they don't have practices, but rather that practices might differ between journals or across an organization, or they might be in development. Of those that did report a standard practice, that ranged from maintaining the HTML unchanged to adding annotations or watermarks, suppressing the HTML, replacing it with the retraction notice or a link to the retraction policy. And one publisher noted that they removed the full text and the metadata from XML. Publishers also noted that this could vary depending on the stage of the publication. If the article had been assigned an issue, HTML would remain, but would be annotated and watermarked. Well, if it was online ahead of print, the HTML would be removed entirely. Next slide, please. So with such a range of practices on the publisher side, not super surprising that the aggregator and the end user subgroup reported that there was a lot of ways that they were receiving metadata and acting upon that metadata. So they could receive metadata in any number of formats, from XML feeds to Excel spreadsheets to the body of an email. The metadata may or may not include a lot of information about the retraction notice. For example, it's often really unclear who's actually authoring the retraction notice. And sometimes it can be difficult to see what is actually being retracted and form those relationships and those linkages within the database. And so this can all create confusion around how to act on these metadata when they're received. This can be further exacerbated by the fact that terminology is variable. So you might have realized that when I was talking about the original aim of CREC, I used the word withdrawal. We actually ended up moving away from the word withdrawal because we realized that it meant three different things to different publishers, and there was very little similarity between what those things actually were. And similarly to with the slide that you saw with the screenshots of Scopus, retraction notices sometimes get marked as errata or corrigenda instead of being retractions, all of which again creates confusion. Now, publishers and aggregators, a lot of them already have and have had internal practices in place to determine how retractions are issued, how they get communicated, what to do when that information is received. But despite these practices, there is this continued use of retracted publication without a lot of awareness being represented. And so the goal of this work really wasn't around promoting like specific workflows or saying that any one publisher or any one aggregator was doing things right. It was really not so much that that's not the problem, that there's different behaviors and different workflows. That's really to be expected with organizations. The challenge here is that the behaviors and the practices weren't mutually intelligible. So people didn't know what was being received, and people were generating things in different ways, and all of that was contributing to an inconsistent user experience, which is one of the challenges that the recommended practice was attempting to solve. So on that note, I'm going to pass things over to Joanna to tell us a bit more about the RP.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure talking to you today. My name is Joanna Terapovich. I work for Taylor & Francis, a publisher of scholarly journals and books. And I want to talk to you about what we actually came up with as a working group. First, I want to clarify again what we are not addressing. Our work did not cover the rationale behind editorial decisions or editorial decision-making process itself. In other words, we're not inspecting why a retraction occurs or how journals and publishers decide to retract an article. That remains the responsibility of editorial boards, publishers, and other stakeholders. Instead, we focus on the practical operational aspects of retractions and removals and expressions of concern. So this includes the transfer of metadata, ensuring that all the relevant systems of publishers, of indexers, of repositories, that they're all updated efficiently when a retraction occurs. We look at how retraction information is communicated and displayed across different platforms to ensure clarity for researchers, librarians, for the public. And we look at implementation and application of these processes, obviously aiming for consistency and transparency in these workflows. Additionally, we're looking beyond just the version of record. While formally published journal articles are primary concern, we also consider other scholarly outputs such as preprints, data sets, conference proceedings, recognizing that research integrity extends beyond just traditional journal publications. Let's move to the next slide, please. All right, so let's take a closer look at the scope that I just described. Here's our table of contents, which outlines how the recommended practice document is structured. It's divided into key sections that I'll cover shortly, but it just gives you a clear picture of our key focus areas, the stakeholders, the key players that are involved, that are mentioned here, the processes that we address, the challenges that we tackle, and some supporting flowcharts and examples that hopefully bring our recommendations to life. And while this document, as you see, is over 60 pages long, it's not just the result of the working group's blood, sweat, and tears. It's 60 pages of our passion for ethics and transparency and scholarly communication with significantly less actual suffering. We promise you that. So if you could please move to the next slide. All right, so now let's dive a little bit deeper into the core areas of our work regarding the receipt, display, and metadata distribution of retractions. Receipt addresses the issues around the proper storage of relevant information, which in turn facilitates transfer, querying, searchability, and of course display, including accessibility standards. Display, that might be the most evident component of this process. Most visible, as you saw on these examples that Caitlin just shared. For the retraction process to be effective, the result must be obvious for the user in the display on the user interface. So examples of what we recommend include adding retracted in all caps before the main title of the publication, which makes it conspicuous, hard to miss. We also recommend prominently displaying a link to the retraction notice or to the expression of concern. Watermarking the PDF or HTML, if feasible, is another recommendation, along with other suggestions how to clearly signpost the status of article retraction or removal. A major component of our work was defining metadata elements. Rather than creating new metadata standards from scratch, we are leveraging existing metadata schemas and identifying which elements are essential, available, recommended. And I will go back to this concept on the next slide. Implementation, another key focus area. We recognize the complexities and challenges of following the recommended process, given the variations in production workflows, specific context, case complexities, and number of handovers between involved teams. So addressing these challenges requires collaboration across multiple stakeholders. To clarify roles and responsibilities, we have incorporated a responsibility assignment matrix. I'm sure you're familiar, often called a RACI matrix. So we have it in our framework. And so it defines who is responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed at each state of the relevant processes, ensuring accountability and smoother implementation. Next slide, please. All right, so our metadata section is probably the juiciest part of our recommendation, but I won't go into that much detail about this today. I just want to talk about some key concepts. We have categorized the metadata elements such as essential is available, and recommended. So essential, these are elements that are critical for accurately recording and communicating a retraction or removal or expression of concern. They should be included in every record. An example might be the work title, publication date, publication source, like just as a journal title. Essential, if available, these are highly valuable, but might not always be present. The publisher might just not have this information. An example might be a DOI or some other identifiers or the article funding. Recommended, these are elements that are useful for enhancing transparency and clarity and assessing the original publication, but they are not strictly required. Examples would be an end page of an article, description of a retraction notice, its cause, retraction of the retraction of this author, or retraction of the notice license information. For our metadata, we're using JATS, which is Journal Article Tag Suite tag libraries, and JATS4R, which is JATS for Use recommendations. Next slide, please. In terms of implementation, we have guidance for these groups listed here on the left. We outline their roles in the process for applying recommendations in publishing updates. So very briefly, for example, journal or publisher, in charge of preparing an update notice following the COPE guidelines. They are in charge and responsible for updating all publication formats, which includes PDF, HTML, XML, etc. And then if the retraction was released online first, they schedule full notice for the next issue, depending on the workflow of the journal. For web vendors, for full text hosts, their responsibilities in implementation include publishing the notice and updated publication simultaneously, distributing metadata and content using established channels, be Crossref, FTPs, web crawlers, etc. And for aggregators, we define their role in implementation as updating metadata and links of the original updated versions, and they also ensure discoverability with proper indexing and publication types. In the recommended practice, we cover also these complex scenarios, more complex scenarios and variations. And to give you a couple examples, that would be EPUB, ahead of print, or a pre-version of record notice. That's when we detail options for handling concerns before the version of record was finalized. Journals that have ceased publishing. Normally, the publisher retains responsibility for updating content and following the recommendations from our document. But if the publisher ceases operation, and the preservation service is in place, then the preservation service assumes responsibility for the updates. But if no accountable entity exists, for example, let's say the publisher has also ceased operations without making arrangements with a long-term preservation service, then we acknowledge that retraction notices might not always be possible to create. Another thing we talk about in our document is when publications transfer to another publisher, which is a very common scenario. So first of all, metadata and links should always transfer along with the content. A new publisher should make best efforts to indicate retracted status and notified third parties. Another interesting complex scenario is when we have single notice for multiple events. Generally, best practice is to include a separate retraction notice or expression of concern for each content item. However, single notices for multiple related events, it's recommended for related retractions. So for example, if they are the part of the same paper mill or the same peer review manipulation, so we provide guidance on how to present those. We talk about materials published in languages other than English. And we include a retraction and republication scenario in which substantial changes are made to the original publication. And then if republished, the original should be handled per these best practices with a new or version DOI for proper discovery. Next slide, please. All right, so as I wrap up the summary, I want to emphasize what comes and highlight what comes next. With the completion of the working group's efforts, responsibility for supporting, educating, and promoting the CREC recommended practice is now transitioning to the standing committee. This committee will play a leading role in ensuring the adoption and implementation of our recommendations, helping stakeholders navigate these best practices. In addition, we recognize there is a number of issues around retractions, removals, and expressions of concern that still need to be addressed. And as we all know, the publishing landscape continues to evolve. Industry requirements might shift, researchers' needs might shift. So the committee will be there to analyze and hopefully respond to these changes. Thank you very much. I will hand it back over to Caitlin.
Thank you, Joanna. So we did want to kind of close out with some what we hope are practical takeaways for librarians, because although this can be a broad topic, there are also still pragmatic things that individuals can do to take action on the recommended practice. So one thing that I think is really important, as librarians, we do actually have a fair amount of power in our negotiations with our vendors, with publishers. And so asking them about what it is they're doing in response to this. Are they adopting the correct guidelines? How are they addressing this issue? Can be a really key point to let them know that this is something that matters to you and to your users. And then, secondarily to asking your vendors about their approach to things, also letting them know when there are problems. If you are seeing that the metadata is incorrect, the display is insufficient, things just aren't as you would expect them to be, as your users would expect them to be, it's really important to let them know that there are these issues. We do also have a lot of control over our own systems, over our own discovery systems. And so we can work to surface metadata and to make it more obvious. I know in my system, we are an Alma Primo shop, and if you have LibKey, LibKey has partnered with Retraction Watch. And so when people attempt to authenticate through to a retracted publication, there is a very big, bold red page that comes up to let them know that this retraction has occurred. And that's one example, but there are other systems and other opportunities there. And letting faculty and students know that retractions are happening, why they're happening, and then potentially some of the strategies that they might be able to use to identify them, things like that libkey integration that I mentioned, but also citation managers like Zotero and EndNote have also partnered with Retraction Watch, and they have flags coming up. So letting people know what's available to them. But we're not only receivers of information. A lot of libraries also have some core library services, whether that is your own publishing services, your institutional repository, thinking about, well, what are our policies if something is retracted or needs to be retracted? Do we have those policies in place? How would we communicate it outwards if that was something that was to occur? And so thinking about how we can adopt policy for ourselves within those core services can also be another useful activity. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Keandra.
Alrighty, everyone. If you are interested in downloading the recommended practice, you can go to this link we have here on the screen, and I'll sort of leave that up for a bit. If you prefer to just go directly to the website, you can go to NISO.org, click on Standards Committees, and then if you click on CREC, it's right there at the top. I just want to take the time to thank you all so much. Thank NASIG Standards Committee, thank CEC for providing this opportunity for us to speak today, and thank you for attending our webinar. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we can begin the questions. We do have some questions that we thought of beforehand that we are going to kick off with. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Keandra, Caitlin, Joanna. First question we have here for you is, what should an instructional librarian who is preparing for a freshman information literacy class know about this topic?
So maybe I'll start off, and Joanna and Keandra, if you want to jump in as well, that'd be great. So certainly it can be really challenging to think about, like, well, how do you introduce the topic of retractions to like a freshman student who's maybe just becoming familiar with scholarly research and with publishing? I'll say I come from like a science librarian background, so I kind of like to tie it into the idea that science has to correct itself over time. Things, new discoveries evolve. And so trying to kind of tie it back to like the ACRL framework around information literacy and this idea of scholarship as dialogue and kind of people in discussion with each other is kind of how I've tried to frame it. But a lot of times, especially for a first-year undergraduate student, just knowing that they really need to think critically about what's out there. They need to be considering these different viewpoints, different perspectives, never relying on a single article, and instead thinking of multiple articles and seeing how they agree or disagree with each other can be kind of a useful way to enter into things.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. I see that one person asked for the link again. It looks like I have the, well, can I not copy it? Let's see here. There we go. It's not the short URL that Keandra had before, but I believe it's a direct link to the CREC document. Okay. We have a question here. Do you have guidance from how to handle them in institutional repositories? At least that's what I believe IR stands for here. I'm thinking about metadata only records where we link out to content, not things we publish that we have been retracted. Not things we publish that have been retracted. I'm sorry. We are largely following your recommendation. Should I read that again? I'm sorry, I kind of. Okay.
Okay. So just to confirm, it sounds like that's a scenario where maybe it's a link out to a published item, and that published item has been retracted, and kind of what to do with the metadata there. Is that a correct understanding? Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, certainly I think it can be challenging to kind of keep on top of what's getting retracted. I would just note that the Retraction Watch database has now been licensed and made openly available by Crossref. And so if you are using Crossref DOIs, there might be a way to kind of build in a check there. There is also some ongoing work from STM about that as well, but that's earlier days still. So that's not, there's not a product there as of yet. But yeah, I would say what I at least periodically do is just try and refer back to Retraction Watch and see, has anything changed? Has anything shifted that I need to update? So if you are doing metadata only records, that can be one way to kind of account for that. And Keandra and Joanna, I don't know if you have any suggestions for, I would read that as just kind of how people can stay on top of what's actually getting retracted, but there might also be another way to approach that problem.
No, I don't have any addition to to that. That's a perfect answer.
Would you then also recommend that for locally hosted content in an institutional repository also follow the standard to, or are there particular things that need to be thought through with that that are different than a publisher site?
Yeah, I think it gets a little bit tricky when we're thinking about locally hosted content, because you might have something that say is like a preprint of a published article. And then if the decision is made by an editorial board to retract the published article, you might look at, well, why is it getting retracted? Does that actually impact the preprint that I have? If it's something that, you have locally, but wasn't published elsewhere, then I would say that's probably an opportunity to maybe almost have like some editorial decision-making policies for your institutional repository, right? Like under what circumstances do you retract something? Do you take it down if it's, a thesis or a dissertation, or it's a conference presentation, or it's any of these things that maybe aren't going to be subject to retraction by like an editorial board or a publisher office.
Great, thank you. Next question. What is helpful to a publisher from a librarian? How do you start this conversation between librarians and publishers?
Might take that one as a publisher representative. First of all, provide feedback to us. If there is if the information that you see in your repositories does not answer your need, does not let you educate your patrons accordingly, if you have seeing information that you have a reason to believe is incorrect, please provide feedback to us or to the NISO group. Then we can look into this, analyze this, and then build this into our processes, maybe update the transfer of metadata, etc. We wouldn't be able to do this if we don't know that there's a problem. So any information that is from you or from your patrons, if you look at something and you still think it's unclear, please provide feedback. That's very valuable to us. And then in terms of starting a conversation, get in touch with us, get in touch with the standing committee that is just about to get rolling. The Keandra just posted an email address. If you think that we didn't look at some angle, something that might be useful to you, get in touch with us, and we'll be sure to analyze it and to take it into consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And let's see here. Speaking from a librarian perspective, can I be confident that retractions and expressions of concern will be easily identified by students and scholars using my library's discovery layer? How about Google Scholar?
So from a librarian perspective, I would say, unfortunately, no. You probably can't be 100% confident. There are things you can do to, increase the confidence. But yeah, that is kind of the issue that we're trying to tackle, is that it's very hard to say with absolute certainty, that something is not retracted just because it doesn't say it's retracted, even when it is in, your library system, which, obviously we all kind of put out there and hope that people have trust in. In terms of Google Scholar, one thing I would notice that Google Scholar really, there are limitations to what Google Scholar can do. They have their agreements with publishers. They can't transform the publisher metadata on behalf of the publisher. So it really is what the publisher is providing to them. And so if the publisher doesn't update the record isn't going to be updated in Google Scholar either. So it is kind of the same challenge of, just because it doesn't say it's not retracted doesn't necessarily mean it isn't retracted. And that certainly is not a critique of Google Scholar in any way. It's simply that they have their own agreements and they have access to the information they have access to.
About Google Scholar, I will add to this that in usual circumstances, there is a good amount of time between an article changing, any update to the article being changed on the publisher's platform and that change being picked up by Google Scholar. Now, for things like retractions, expressions of concerns, there are mechanisms that we can minimize this change or that the period of time where there's discrepancy between the platform and Google Scholar. But not every publisher is doing that yet. Not every publisher has these tools. So that is one of the things that we'll have to address as the standing committee, to sort of reach out a little bit further, not just repositories, but also indexing services such as Google Scholar. But our goal is to, I don't think we'll ever be able to say, no, you can be confident that expressions of concern and retractions will be always easily undefinable, but with our work, we're trying to bring it as closely to always as reasonably possible. Thank you.
So even if the publisher does the right thing and puts the retracted label in the title of the article, it may or may not get to everywhere in a timely fashion.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Okay, let's see here. What would increase transparency between publishers and librarians regarding communications of retractions from your point of view? What do you wish they knew?
I think what we just said, that the publisher can do all the right things and mark their content as retracted and then be transparent about this. And it still will not be picked up everywhere because there are so many handover points between the metadata that we release and the metadata that might end up with the actual metadata information that your patrons use. So I think that this is something that we need to be honest about and understand this. And that's something that librarians need to understand and work with us towards changing it. I think together we can identify where these breaks happen, where these delays happen. And then hopefully the committee will be able to address it and maybe eliminate some of these hurdles. Anything else, Caitlin, that or Keandra?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would just say, just in the interest of transparency, is that I would encourage librarians not to assume that publishers, web vendors, anybody providing information knows what the specific problems are. Oftentimes, people are dealing with thousands, maybe millions of records, and these are large, complex organizations. So, your representative who you're talking to may not have any idea that there is an issue, but I've yet to meet any publisher that doesn't want to know when there is a problem. So I would just really encourage librarians, when you realize that there is an issue, to bring that forward and to keep bringing it forward to help notify and help to also inform your publisher too of like what you consider to be an issue, and really speak up for your patrons who maybe are saying like, this is confusing, I don't understand this, because your publishers, they don't know your patrons like you know your patrons.
Yeah, I would like the librarians to understand that we do take retractions removals, expression of concern seriously. Every publisher takes them seriously. We have teams involved, they investigate them. These cases are rarely easy. They are usually complex because the reasons are so different and the circumstances of each case are so different. So that's what I want to share with you. We take them all very seriously. We investigate them in detail, then make these editorial decisions, and then try to communicate them as clearly and be as transparent about this as possible. And I think most publishers, if not all publishers, are like this. It's just our end goal. End goal is the same, but the display was not always the same. But we're not trying to hide anything. We're not trying to be shady about any of these things. We want the retracted articles to be clear, transparent, and that's something that we want you to know, and we want your students, your researchers, your patrons to understand as well.
Okay, we have a couple other questions which have generally been addressed by the presenters, but I'll try asking, maybe there's a first take on it. So what are your perceptions of this area as far as librarians are concerned? Do you think they're pretty familiar with what's happening here, or do you think that we really do need to do a better job in the community to share this information?
I mean, I'll say, like, at least for myself, I never learned about retractions in library school. Like, it wasn't something that we spoke about, you know, and it's not that they weren't necessarily happening, but it just wasn't a topic of conversation. And so for me personally, I kind of got interested in this area because a colleague pointed out, like, oh yeah, this one paper said it's retracted in this database and it's not in this database. And we started talking about, like, what might be going on there. But it was never anything that that I personally learned about. And so it's been really helpful and informative to have, you know, have that opportunity to learn a little bit more about publishing misconduct, research misconduct, some of these underlying and related issues as well.
Thank you. And we have another question. Are retractions much more common now? Thinking about to when I was in library school versus now. Also, if I can add to that, like the world of science and social versus social science and humanities. Can you speak to that as well?
Yeah, so broadly, I would say they are much more common now. I think there was an article in Nature that found that in 2022, 1 out of every 500 papers that was published was also retracted. So it's still like a pretty small percentage of the overall body of literature, but it has increased significantly over time. That's not a bad thing. Like when something's wrong, we want it to get corrected. We want it to be retracted. And so in part, I think it might also be like we have clearer metadata, we have more transparent practices, we have open data. So there are just more opportunities to see where there might be a problem. In terms of science versus social science and humanities, I must admit, I said I was a science librarian, so that's kind of where my focus is. I get the impression that in certain social sciences, it's kind of a known issue. There have been a couple of cases in psychology that have been very notable. But humanities, I don't get the impression there's quite the same body of retractions, although Joanna and Keandra, please correct me if I'm just speaking from ignorance there. Oh, Joanna, I think you're muted.
You would think I would know how to work this. I don't actually have the numbers for this, but I wanted to say that I do agree. I think the number in social sciences, humanities is a bit less. It's a little smaller number. But also in terms of our attractions, much more common now. Yes, because we have more science now. So it's, and they are, you know, with this work, we try to demystify it and retractions in certain areas still have a little bit of stigma, I think. And with this push towards transparency, we want to just show that this is just a science correcting itself. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That more doesn't mean that the science is worse. Quite the contrary, probably. So.
All right, thank you all. And Kendra just shared a link to a Nature article on the topic, and it cites the work of the committee, and I'm looking forward to reading it. So we are at hour, and I'm not sure if I'm closing it out, but I guess it's like I'm speaking now. So thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you all at a future conference or future webinar conference. Take care.